This conference will now be recorded.
Hey everybody, I'm Melody Span Cooper. I am the author of the Girlfriend's Guide to Closing the Deal. I don't know if you could see the cover. And I'm also the chair of Midway Broadcasting Corporation, two radio stations in the Chicagoland area. And this is part of my podcast series called the E-Series for Entrepreneurs. And it's just a supplement to the book. And, I haven't done it and I haven't done a podcast, Andrea, in at least 3 or 4 months or longer. It's probably been longer than that. And, it's been a lot going on in this America, right? But what an incredible time to pick it up and to pick it up with someone like my incredible guest, who is also a dear friend of mine. I want to introduce you to Andrea Johnson. She's the executive director of the Courageous Conversation Global Foundation. And she is one of the nation's foremost authorities on race. And not just because of the George Floyd situation. She was doing this way ahead of time. So let's start there, Andrea. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the Courageous Conversation Global Foundation?
All right. Hey, everybody. Good to be here with you, Mel, and with the rest of the listeners. This is an incredible time in our history. And as we get into our subject matter in a minute, when we're talking about race in the workplace, as you said in the opening, this isn't just about the moment we're living in. This is an age-old issue that those of us who've been fortunate enough to work in some pretty awesome spaces have been navigating in one way or another. You asked about our foundation and the work that I do. Courageous Conversation Global Foundation was actually birthed out of a 30-year history of work in the racial equity field. So we're a young foundation. We're only 3 years old. However, our parent that birthed us, Courageous Conversation, is, as I said, 30 years old, and I actually work on both sides of the business. So I do consulting worldwide. We're a global foundation and a global company. I do writing and design work in the racial equity field, and the foundation's focus is community. So I'm really excited to be the executive director of the foundation because we had been doing this work in corporations and in school districts and I mean, you name it in terms of the workplace. Our company has been doing racial equity work, racial transformation work for a long time in those spaces. But to be able to go deep into communities and develop leaders. So we develop leaders who are community activists, who've been in the game a long time and want some additional skill sets to really push the conversation about race even deeper and begin to push other systems to be more equitable, not just diverse, because diversity is checking a box.
Mm.
Who's in the room? Equity is really about having not only a seat at the table, but the systems that supported us not being there being changed. So, how do we do that in communities? We also work with young people in the foundation. So, we have a leadership fellows program for university students here in the United States and in Auckland, New Zealand, at the University of Auckland. So, that's the
Wow.
work that the foundation does.
That's pretty impressive. And before we sign off tonight, I want you to share information so people who want to support the foundation could give. This has got to be or should be a very prosperous time for your organization, Andrea, based on what's going on in the world. Who would have thought, who would have thunk, as we say sometimes, that we'd be having these courageous conversations that are happening all over the country. And for the sake of this conversation, it's happening in corporations. It's happening in the workplace. And that's where I'd like to center the conversation this evening on navigating race in the workplace, because you taught me something, and I share this often with people. One night we were just out, doing our thing and having drinks, and you said, you know what, 99% of our time as African Americans we spend navigating our existence, our behavior patterns as it relates to white America, right? Because we come in contact with them at work or at school. And it's really something as African Americans, when you think about it, Andrea, that we adopt very early on. Some people become acclimated to changing how they talk or immediately changing how they act when they get in a setting outside that which is familiar. So we're taught that, socialized about that at a very young age. And so now we get into corporate America. And then all of a sudden, I think this is a cultural revolution. That's what I'm calling it. We get to a point where white folks are like, I didn't know you were reacting like that or that exists. Talk a little bit about what is happening now during this time when people feel comfortable, are getting comfortable with discussing race.
So I'm going to back up before I answer your question, and I want to
Okay.
make sure I get this in right. So you said this is probably a time when folks are wanting to support the work that the foundation does, and I want to
Mhm.
make sure that folks know how you can support our work financially, right?
Okay.
Because without those dollars, we're a 501c3. And we rely on folks giving to the foundation in order for us to go deep into communities. And so if you go to www.ccglobalfoundation.org, there's a donate button. And we take donations of all sizes. And what we really love is when folks do a membership so that you
Mhm.
donate every month. Because even if you're donating $25 a month, that really helps us keep the lights on, so to speak. Of
Yeah.
course, if you're in an organization that does matching, that's always even better, right? So those larger donations in particular, but that's how you can help us continue to do our work. And I will say, it's really fascinating. As I said, we're only a 3-year-old foundation. And as we have gone out in the development space, what we bumped up against until now, up until the current moment we're in, there were people that said, well, we're not really funding the work that you do, which is systems change work. We're funding tangible things like, although I think system change is tangible, but we want to fund clean water for Flint, which is great. I mean, Flint needs clean water. Or we
Right.
want to fund scholarships, or those things that are what I call low hanging fruit.
Mm-hmm.
The
Yes.
work that we do is deep work, and it requires sustained engagement over time. So, for example, if I'm going into a community, I was in Kansas City last August, and do a series of workshops with that community, we're going to stick with you for several months because the work that needs to happen in your community isn't a hit it and quit it, if you will. It's
Yeah.
a commitment over time to sustaining the work, which brings me to the other question you asked.
Okay, and I
So,
want you to come back at the end of the session also and repeat the contact information. So,
absolutely, absolutely.
yes.
So, W.E.B. Du Bois's concept of dual consciousness is what you alluded to in your opening of this segment, that since our time in this country, right? So when the Africans were brought over and, um, the chattel slavery enterprise, as it is known in this land, began, we had to adopt this notion that I can be this way in this setting and this way in another setting in order to save your life.
Mm.
So when white folks will say to me, well, I have to be different with my friends than I am, in the workplace, you're not going to be killed if you show up a certain way. And we are. I mean, that's how real that is in our history and in our contemporary context. So historically, we would have, and this is something that if you know Dr. Joy DeGruy's work, she talks about post-traumatic slave syndrome. And she talks about things that are in our DNA from that time of being enslaved that have carried forward, some of which serve us well, some don't. Right.
Mm.
So one thing Dr. Joy talks about is parenting, right? So I've got 3 kids, and many of you who are listening might be parents. And one thing we teach kids growing up is not to get too full of yourself in public.
Hmm.
Right? So
That's right.
we don't brag about our kids like some white people might brag about their kids. We hold back, don't show everybody what you can do. And that is from a time when we were enslaved. If
Yes.
we were seen as too valuable, like you're really strong, right? They might sell you. If my little boy is strong and he's 6, the master might look and say, "Ooh, that's a strong boy. He can pick a lot of cotton. He's six
Hmm.
years old now." So I'm worried that you're going to sell him away because he's valuable. And
Yeah.
the other piece is if you know too much, then you might learn how to read. And so if you share that you're smart, you not only you won't get sold, you'll be hanging, you'll be dead.
Hmm.
And so those are things that show up again and again in contemporary context, where as parents we are always teaching our children how do you behave around white people from
Hmm.
small, right? So even though in my mother's generation it was, you can't go in that store, you can't sit in that place, you can't, right? And then for our generation, it was, well, you better talk this way or they'll think you don't know anything. When you go out, you better dress this way. I can remember I used to live in the Chicago area, and I wish I had known you then, right? It's
I
so
do too.
crazy that we didn't even know each other when we were both living in the Chicago area.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I would, and again, some of you listening may know this place. So, because it's pretty famous. And even though, even if you weren't from Chicago, you may know of New Trier High School. So,
Hmm.
in
Absolutely.
okay, so Winnetka,
Blue
Illinois.
Cheer is
So
one of
I,
the best high schools, not only in the
in the, in,
Chicagoland area, but in the country.
in the country,
No,
right? So
right?
when I first moved, I'm originally from Detroit. So when I first moved from Detroit to Chicagoland, and I ain't gonna perk, I'm from Detroit, like Detroit. Like I lived in the city of Detroit
Now,
where I grew up.
right?
I did not. Okay, so I'm just saying, northwest side of Detroit is where I grew up and went to school and all that. However, when I moved to the Chicago area, I lived in the Chicagoland suburbs. So I ain't gonna try to pretend like I was living in the city because I wasn't. Howsoever, I was working at New Trier High School. That was my first job in the Chicago area. And I noticed that, well, my colleagues noticed that what they call dressed up to come to work. Now, I was taught when you black and you going to work, you better put on your work clothes. You
Hmm.
don't go to work in your casual. I don't care. They could call it casual, whatever they want. Casual Fridays. No, 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 no. When you're black, you better show up correct in some clothes that look like you going to work.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they won't take you seriously. And I was teaching dance. So I'm
Mm.
still coming dressed. Now I know I got to put my dance clothes on when I get there, but then I'm putting on professional clothes to go into a meeting, to meet with parents, all of those things. And they go, "Girl, you always dressed up." Yeah, yes, I
Yeah.
am, because I don't want you to mistake me for somebody that doesn't belong in the building.
Yes.
Right. So
Yes.
that's one of the ways we adapt racially. The other thing that happened when I got the job, so the superintendent, he was really cool. We're having this conversation as I'm being interviewed, and I get the job, and I'm calling him Doc. It was Dr. Bangser at the time, and he kind of laughed. He's like, "Andrea, you can call me Hank." I'm like, I can't. And again, as a black person who was socialized to understand what you do in white spaces, for me to refer to him um, by anything other than his formal title was inappropriate. Like,
Yeah.
I can't call you the superintendent. How am I gonna call you Hank? Right? But
Right.
culturally, in that space, that's what they did. Eventually, I got it. I finally figured out that it was okay for me to do that. But I was worried. I had been in Detroit up until then. I'd grown up there, worked there, and it worked in Detroit public schools. And now here I am in this, highfalutin suburb, and the superintendent, is he setting me up? Like, if I
Right.
go
That's
his
right.
way,
That's right.
am I gonna lose my job?
That's right. But you know something in that also, so you come to work dressed up and you are in your space of acceptance, quote unquote, just how we're taught to be accepted. But on the other side of the fence is how we are received. Because I often hear white folks say, "Oh, you speak so well," as if we're not expected to speak that way, right? So it is perceptions all around. It's a 360-degree kind of, proposition there. It is what we how we are intentionally showing up and
Right.
how the perception of us when we show up that we
Well,
battle.
absolutely, absolutely. And in terms of being instructive in this moment, in the work
Yeah,
that I do. So, how do you navigate that when you're in the workplace? How,
yeah,
when your white colleague says you're articulate, what do you do? I mean, I've had that happen. I had two incidents. I had one where I'd left New Trier and I gotten a job at another suburban school, and I got a promotion. So
yeah.
here I am. I'm their first Black administrator in this other suburb. And a white colleague, calls and says, I just want to welcome you, and I want you to know we don't see you as Black.
Oh,
Now, I'm sitting there going, okay, so who's blind? That's
right.
what's happening in my head. And whether it's that comment or your articulate comment, it doesn't matter that the intent is honorable. So
Mm,
someone calling me articulate, I'm going to give you the grace to say, you thought you were giving me a compliment. Just
right.
like my new colleague thinking, I don't see you as Black as a compliment. But in the work that we do, I know it's not landing well on me. And if
Mhm.
all I do is turn the other cheek and say nothing, it's going to weigh on me. And pretty soon, those things are going to weigh so heavy, I'm going to start having headaches.
Mm,
I'm going to maybe not come to work. I may not do my best work. I might not talk to people very often. And now another narrative starts. She's not participating. She doesn't feel like she's part of our team. Those kinds of things start to happen because I'm trying to protect myself from all of these things that are happening in the workplace
sure,
under the guise, or not the guise, from some well-meaning people, right?
sure.
Right. And so, what I would like to share to your listeners is figure out a way to speak your truth and let whoever it is that said it know how it landed on you and what the
Yeah.
history is of it. So that contemporary context and the historical impact. So what I did with the guy who said, "Oh, so now I've identified it was a man," um, who said they didn't see me as Black. I couldn't address it in the moment because I just gotten the job and there was no
Mm,
way I was going. I had no money in the bank with that person. They
yeah.
didn't know me, so I waited and I waited until I put a little bit of skin in the game. It meaning there was a little bit of a relationship. So I'd been there. You could see that I'm really I'm not the angry Black woman, and all of that. And privately, I I just said, when you called to welcome me, you said you didn't see me as Black. And I need you to know what that felt like for me. And I said, for me, when you say that, it implies that to see me as Black would have been a bad thing. And I love my Blackness. I love every Black thing about me. And I need you to know that that's okay to notice that I'm Black and all the beauty and wonderful things that I bring to the table being Black. I just need you to know that. And then I just kind of let it go because, of course, there were the apologies and and
Sure.
I did not need or want any of that. I
Yeah.
just, I needed,
You need to release.
and I
You need
needed
to
my
address.
colleague to know because I don't want them to do that to somebody else.
Yeah. So interestingly enough, I got a lot out of what you just said. You said you waited,
Hmm.
right? You waited. Um, since we are in the midst of this cultural revolution, and white our white counterparts in the office now are wanting to have a conversation, right? Are
Yes,
feeling more comfortable with having conversation.
yes.
Should we just unload? I mean, should we just start sharing, every transgression, or should we continue to do as you did and you know um, temper our responses? How should we react now that the moment is here and the conversation should begin? I think that's a better way of putting it.
Well, I would say a conversation has to be a two-way street. And often when we're talking about race, there's an assumption that the Black person has a racial experience and the white person doesn't. And the white
Mm,
person needs to learn what the Black person's racial experience has been. And what that does is set up a dynamic that's very unhealthy. And
yeah,
it
we
is
victim.
very
We always victim. Yeah,
right,
well, I
and
never
it's
thought of that like
burdensome.
Andrea.
It's burdensome.
Yeah,
It's kind of like, sure, there have been all these things that have been happening, but in this moment that we're in right now, if we're going to change that pattern of the way we have been communicating, then it has to be a two-way street. So if you come to me and say, and actually this is kind of happened. It has happened since the moment we're in, and you call me and you say, well, Andrea, I just really want to know how, what was it like when you were working with us, whatever, as the only Black woman on our team.
sure.
And then and I'll say, I know you asked me a question, but I actually have a question for you. So I'd like to know what it was like for you to have me as your colleague. That's what I'd like to know. What was it like for you
Mm,
as a white person to have me as your colleague? What did you have to learn? And then see what they have to say, right? And then the next question I have is, how often have you had colleagues that look like me, that work that closely with you? Tell me your story. Tell me, okay, so now that I understand, whatever their story is, let's say their story is they grew up in a very racially diverse area. I'm not the first Black person they ever been around, blah, 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 blah. So then I'll say, well, why is it, whatever their answer is, why is it that you're curious about my experience right now? We've been
yeah.
working together for the last 5 years
Hmm.
and we've never talked about race. So what's different?
Hmm.
And and again, by shifting the focus away from my pain, because if I have to take the band-aid off again and again and again, that's not going to be good for you and it's not going to be good for me. And really, if you haven't explored your own whiteness, and I'm not just talking about the buzzwords, white fragility and white privilege, there's a whole socialization that happens for every race. You learn what it means to be in the skin you're in.
Yeah,
And and that's deeper than a buzzword. So what
yeah.
do you know about yourself as a white person when you got to work with me as a Black person? What do you know about yourself?
Wow.
Right?
Wow,
And
that
then
catch them off guard because in this very inquisitive state that everyone is in and feeling free to talk about it, nobody thinks to ask. Again, we're always the victim, or we're always the, what do you call it, the guinea pig. We're always being explored, right? We're always being studied. But nobody stops to study the actions of our white counterparts in these positions. So that was you actually empowered. You became the empowering force in that. They called to get,
absolutely.
well, let me, and you helped them get to their answer,
Oh,
which
absolutely.
that's fascinating. Very
Well, and
fascinating
the
approach.
other piece of it is having genuine curiosity in the conversation. So I'm not asking those questions just to put them off. I really want to know because I don't know. We've
Right.
never had a conversation about race. So if we're going to have it, let's have a full-fledged conversation about race from what I know well, which is I know well what it's like to be Black, and I know what it's like to be Black in white spaces and in Black spaces and in other spaces. You know
Sure.
what it's like to be white,
Yeah.
right? In all of those, well,
In
in,
all of those spaces.
well,
So I
in
think a
some,
lot of people now, Andrea, are dealing with the question of our white counterparts coming to us and asking us, well, what should I do? I mean, what can I do? We're hearing that so often, and in many circles, it's becoming quite frustrating because,
yeah,
I mean, it's obvious if you haven't been doing it, have you read a book? It's so many questions. I almost want to put together a checklist of things that kind of will help you usher into, right, your fullness in your cultural revolution. I'm experiencing, white friends who have never read an African American book.
yeah,
They don't know one real African American author. They don't know celebrities who have written a book, but the Ta-Nehisi Coates and so many other individuals they've never heard of, right? Who
that's
tell
right,
our
that's right,
story. And
that's
I
right.
think about the books that I've read and how many books I've read that were written by white people, right?
Hmm.
How many
Hmm.
organizations we participate in. They want to know, well, who should I give to? And
Hmm.
just wanting to do the right thing, almost like a quick fix, right?
That's
So
right,
talk
that's
to
right.
us about how we can um, help our white counterparts just kind of manage the expectations and understanding that this is not a sprint. This is a
That's right.
marathon that we want them to embark on, right?
That's right. So my response would be, first of all, if you would like to be a someone who is really committed to racial justice, right, and racial transformation, and I'll even go a step further. The real work is dismantling white supremacy. So this notion that white is better, and it has permeated every aspect of that's when we say systemic racism, it's predicated on white in the category of being called white and whiteness being better than anything else. Everything else, whether you're Black, whether you're Asian, whether you're indigenous, all of that is under the category of whiteness. And so if that's the work that my colleague, your colleague is interested in doing, then it's twofold. Well, I'd say three. One is find a group of other white people who are doing this same work or interested in doing this work, who are further on their journey than you are. And there are a few organizations in every city, like there's one called Surge, SURJ, I believe it's the acronym. Don't ask me what it stands for, but it's white people doing racial justice work. There are authors, including Robin DiAngelo, which I know she's on TV all the time. So a lot her work is brilliant. I know Robin,
Yeah.
her work is great, but she's not the only one out there. There are women who, Anne Braden, if they don't know the name Anne Braden was a white woman who was in the racial justice space back in the 50s, in the 1950s. So if you've never heard of Anne Braden, look her up. Who was doing work in the 50s and 60s? The Durrs, Virginia Durr and her husband, Richard, I believe is his name. They are white people who were doing work during the Montgomery bus boycott. Richard Durr was a lawyer. They had crosses burned on their lawns, just like crosses were burned on Black people's lawns. So if you don't know those names, learn them, find out who they are, what they did, how they stayed in the fight, as well as some of the contemporary writers. But reading isn't enough. So that's one thing. You can read and you can go back in history and find. The next thing to do is, if you have a multiracial group of friends, then examine it. Like, is it really a multiracial group of friends, or are these people that you see at work or in one setting. But when you're trying to think about who is it that you're going to have dinner with, a small intimate dinner, or who is it that when something traumatic happens in your life, you're going to call, if none of those names pop up, they're not really your friend. So so think about, like, go through your head, who are
Yeah.
the people that are not white in your life that if something traumatic happened in your life, you would call them and say, hey, I just need to talk right now today. Or if you have children, you leave your kids with, right? So if you have those people, then nurture those relationships with race conversations, because often I have white friends who've been in fellowship with Black folks and other folks of color, and they never talk about race. So
Hmm.
initiate the conversation about race with your friends of color if you got them. If you don't have any, figure out how to get you some in an
Right.
authentic way, right? Because
Right.
when
I'm
you
shocked
are,
sometimes of white folks who've never been in a Black person's home.
that's
I'm
right,
really shocked by that.
that's right.
It's amazing to me. I think that speaks to race, and your racial proclivity. I mean, to not have in 2020 ever been into on a social setting an African American's home or had them in your home. I think that's quite telling.
Well, but I'll be really honest. I can say that the white people in my life that I would truly say, using this metric that I just laid out, are my friends, are few and far between. And it wasn't until I confronted my own biases and
Mm,
my own socialization and realized I did not have, especially women, white women in my life that transcended our circumstance to the point where they really were my friends. I just didn't have them. And I was, I was a middle-aged woman when I realized
yeah,
that. There have been, I had some white friends in high school, or, a few
sure.
of them or whatever, but not with the same metric. So I had to do that same examination for myself. And then a white friend and I decided together that we were going to go on this racial equity journey and nurture a friendship relationship.
So you
And
do have
then
to put the effort in, and it has to be
that's
on
exactly
intention.
right.
I think that's what you're saying. It
It's
has to be on intention.
intentional
Yeah,
and it's authentic, and
yeah,
both of you have to work on it.
sure.
And because I did that with one person, it was easier for me to develop that with somebody else, right?
Hmm.
And I didn't have to be as explicit with these other folk. Like,
Sure.
not that I got a whole lot gaggle of folks, lurking around, because I'm not one that has a whole lot of people all up in my grill,
Sure.
just by nature, right? However, that's the second one. So the first one is in this thinking space, or and that was easy to get books to read, and that white folks have written, and that organizations that white people have done, and really getting deeper into whiteness and this history. The second one is having those multiracial true relationships that
Yeah.
transcend circumstance. And the third one is read scholarship from Black scholars from multiple generations.
Hmm.
So if you haven't read Destruction of the Black Civilization by Chancellor Williams, if
Yeah.
you haven't read Derek Bell's work and haven't really dug deeply into Delgado's theories of critical race theory from the Black perspective, if
Hmm.
you haven't read Ivan Van Sertima's They Came Before Columbus, or if you haven't read, some of Cornel West's work, and Michael Eric Dyson's. I mean, even though those are names that you might have heard, have you read their
Sure.
scholarship?
Yeah.
Have you
Yeah.
read their scholarship? And if you
Yeah.
haven't, then read their scholarship and take it in the same ways you would take in a white scholar's work,
Yeah.
because that education, and there are a lot of Black people that don't read Black scholarship either,
I was going to say
right?
that, Andrea. You were rattling off them books. I'm like, it's some brothers and sisters listening to us right now. who
Yeah, the
haven't read
ISIS
those books?
papers, Francis Cress Wesleyan,
Yeah, and they can
you,
strengthen their
that's
muscles
right.
by reading this. So
That's
it
exactly
really goes.
right.
Yeah, absolutely,
Bell
absolutely.
hooks, and so this nonfiction work. I love fiction. I love reading, Toni Morrison and Alice Walker, and I
Yeah,
love poetry. And I also know that these theoretical exercises that people like W.B. Du Bois, like if you read Frederick Douglass's essays, if you
sure.
read James Baldwin's essays, not just
Yes.
his fiction. And all of a sudden, you understand psychologically what has happened. And then you're not burdening your colleague all the time because
Yeah.
you've got a historical perspective, right? So those are the three things I would say.
I like that. What is the best way that Blacks in corporate America, or just who work in spaces where there are majority whites, which in often cases is a majority of us, right? Um, what is the best way to, I want to say, take advantage of this moment, but to seize the power of this moment? I think that's a better way to put it. While
Yeah,
people are listening
yeah,
with both ears about
yeah,
race.
yeah. Leveraging this moment is very critical because as we see companies put out public statements, for example. So if you work for one of these companies that's put out a public statement saying Black Lives Matter or something about racial justice, then use that as a way to have a conversation with those who have the control to change things and say, I noticed that you put this statement out and I'm really excited about it. And I'd like to have a conversation about the composition of the board of directors. And
Hmm,
I'm curious, do you know that Alex O'Hannon, who, as you know, had a seat on his board for Reddit,
sure.
publicly announced that he gave up his seat
That's right.
and has insisted that that seat be filled by a person of color?
Now, for those of people who are watching, you need to know that is Serena Williams' husband, who
That's
owns
right.
the tech company, right?
That's exactly right. And
So,
so by giving the concrete example and having the ask to say you've done something good by putting out your statement. Now, systemic change requires changes to the system.
mhm.
And one of the places the system is held in place is at the board of director level. So, have you all considered either having somebody come off the board or some people come off the board and having a metric, right, that you're
Yeah,
explicit about, right? And
yeah,
be ready though. If you have that conversation, get ready because somebody is going to say, oh, but we need people with quality. Or somebody's going to say, we can't find people. And so be ready for those retorts and remind whoever it is you're talking to who has the agency to make the change or make the suggestion. Say, well, actually, I know quite a few people that are not only qualified, but would do an incredible job. I got a little short list for you.
yeah,
And this is
absolutely.
their resume. So be ready because that's the next thing that happens. And it it happens as a deflection, but it also happens because of what we just talked about. So if as a white person, your colleague doesn't have many people of color, Black folks in particular, in their close knit circle, they don't know anybody and they buy into this narrative that there aren't many of us out there. Well, we know there are a whole lot of us out there. Y'all just ain't calling.
Right. That's
We
right.
already know that. So
That's
then I'm gonna say, well, Melody Span Cooper,
right.
she, or let's fill in the blank, would be a great candidate. Why don't you call her?
Mhm.
And I got her number. Want me to
Yeah,
grease the
that's
skids
right.
for you? And so if you don't feel like you can go all the way to the board level of the company, there's another place in the company that you can say, we've been doing a great job with this. but I've been the only person in the creative department my whole career. I've been here for 20
Sure.
years. I'm the only person of color in the creative department. And that is very isolating, and it's not good for the bottom line.
Should we be all in these conversations now, though, Andrea, understanding that, this is all new and everybody's all inquisitive and they're being open and they're pouring their hearts out? Or should we pace ourselves, understanding that this just may be a moment in time and this could come back to haunt us later? How should we be reacting as African Americans, Blacks in corporate environments that are having the talk right now? Are we all in, or should we just pace ourselves?
Look, my philosophy is be all in and ask for everything, because you don't know how long it's gonna last. I mean, really, if you're good at what you do, and most folk who have made it in corporate America are way better than a whole lot of the mediocre white people they work with. Let's get real. That's true. I mean, I know so many people who got positions because of, a family lineage, or, I mean, we belonged to a country club when we were in Illinois. There were so many deals that were made on that golf course, and we benefited from some of it,
Yeah,
as the only Black family in the club. But those white families have been benefiting for a long time. And I'm not saying that somebody who had less credentials doesn't do a good job, because you could have less credentials sometimes and then rise to the occasion.
sure.
However, if you're Black, you don't even get in the door
Mm.
unless you're phenomenal in corporate
I
America.
say that all the time. White people don't hire mediocre Black folks
No,
for too long.
no,
Notice
no,
that
no.
caveat,
You
for
don't
too
you don't
long.
even
If
get
you've been
in
in
the
the company
door.
a while, you are an
That's right.
excellent performer. You are a
That's
high,
exactly right.
you can
That's
trust
right.
that.
I mean,
Yeah,
even in the school system, when I worked at New Trier, somebody asked me once, and I was an advisor as well as, I taught dance, I taught English, and they were like, well, they asked me if I faced, racism with regard to people thinking I was less than, when I'm interacting with families. And I was like, no, their assumption is if I'm Black and I got hired, I must be damn good. Like that was
yes,
the assumption, right? And so given that that's your baseline, that the assumption is you're really good and you better be really good or you can't stay. So now
that's
I'm here. So
right.
take advantage of the moment. And the door is open now to have the conversation out loud that you've been having in your head all the time.
All the
And
time.
again, it's not the conversation about, oh, woe was me. Look how much racism happened to me. It's the conversation of, oh, you've said you'd like things to be different. I can help you make them different. Let's talk,
I love
right?
that. Love
Right.
that.
So there's
Last
no
question.
harm there.
Last question, Andrea. Is this a moment or is this a movement?
Oh, I hope it's a movement. I think it's a movement, and the indicators for me that it's quite possibly a movement are um, a couple of things. A, the coronavirus, once we started talking about racial disparities in the virus, and that became really prevalent in the conversation, then the whole idea of racism being real can't be denied, because it's not a person, it's a virus that is disproportionately impacting communities of color, Black people in particular, even in wealthy areas, okay? Even people that have good health insurance, right? That kind of thing. And the underlying conditions that came out when people say, oh, yeah, but they got diabetes and blah, blah, blah. Well, that also has to do with racism, right? A lot of those underlying conditions. So, the fact that we have the entire nation, the world stopped for this long is allowing this to be a movement, not a moment. If we
Mm,
weren't in a situation where so many people have to work from home and aren't out with a lot of distractions, it would have been gone already.
Sure.
When we've got protests happening in Utah, in North Dakota, in Montana, and some little towns in Michigan outside of Detroit where I know it's Klan country because I used to live, in Detroit. Like, and there are Black Lives Matter protests. We ain't no black people.
Yeah.
In critical race theory, we call that interest conversion, right? Where the interests of the status quo intersect with the interest to make change.
Mm.
And so I believe, and I hope I'm not being pie in the sky, but I believe it's a movement. And some things have already started to happen. I mean, the things that have happened, for example, conversations and action around taking police officers out of school buildings and hopefully replacing them with more social workers and counselors,
Yeah.
right? Those kinds of concrete steps.
Yeah.
I hope that those are the indications that it's and moving a statue or changing the name of something, Aunt Jemima, yeah, you know how we do. I
Oh
don't
yeah.
care. We gonna
Yeah.
call
Come
it Aunt
on.
Jemima. I
Right.
don't care. You can
Yeah.
change the name, and I think you should, but we still gonna call it that because we call
Right.
all pancakes Aunt Jemima, right? Right. Just
Right.
like we call all tissue Kleenex, even though
Right.
we know it's not all Kleenex.
Right.
However, what goes on behind that? It's not just changing the name, it's also changing the beliefs that led to that name being there for so long in the first place. And I think
Absolutely.
that's what's starting to happen.
That is so powerful. I love this. I love this conversation with you. Thank you so much, Andrea. And I know many of you probably just saw something that looked like a wolf that was behind me. I need I need to let people know the beauty of what's going on now is your office is at home, right? So I could take off my pajamas, throw on this dress. Me and Andrea are not twins. We don't have on the same dress, but that was my dog that just walked in the office so that people know that. Andrea, please share
Yeah.
again how people can donate and contact the Courageous Conversation Global Foundation.
All right. Go to www.ccglobalfoundation.org. And we would love for you to donate and connect to us. We push things out through our website, get on our mailing list. We have trainings. We've got an academy going on right now. And you can learn about talking about race and making systemic change right in your own home. So,
I love that. I love that
yeah.
so much. And again, all of this is because I have a podcast called the E-Series for Entrepreneurs, and it's as a result of the book that I've written, The Girlfriend's Guide to Closing the Deal. I'm gonna hold it up one more time. I'm sorry, it's hard to be an art. Oh, it's
It's
back.
upside down, girl. Turn around.
Look, girl, it's hard to be a aspiring author and a full-time boss. It is, and so the book, I know I haven't done much promotion of it, but it's my baby, and it's special, and it's really a decent book. And
Oh, no, 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 no. It is more than decent. I have read it more than once. I
it's
have given it as a gift
it's
to a couple of women who are new in their entrepreneurial pursuits. And what I love about your book, Melody, is it's so user friendly.
yeah.
It really is. When she titled it A Girlfriend's Guide, you feel like you're talking to a girlfriend and
Oh,
you're getting these wonderful pearls of wisdom, all of the experience that you've had as an entrepreneur from a very young age. Any woman will will benefit from it.
I appreciate that so much, Andrea, and on your work to help me deliver it. And Andrea is actually mentioned in the book. So the book is available on Amazon, or if you care to have me sign it, you can get it at melodyspancooper.com. Andrea Johnson, you are the double bomb, okay? And I want this season to just make the Courageous Conversation Global Foundation all that it can be, the biggest thing in the world, because it is your season, girl. You got a seat at the table. I talk about that in the book all the time, and I know you're getting ready to close a whole lot of deals, right?
Well, I hope so.
Thank you so much, my dear friend. Thank you.
All right. Love you. Take
All right.
care.
Thanks now.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
bye.
Thank you, everyone.